Quasiduplicate is the definition of a card with potential. If the format provides the right creatures, the semi-clone spell could go off the rails, and that's why it's landed in 2 of my own sleeper videos. But there are plenty of folks experimenting with the card right now, and we've seen YouTube brewers try everything from blue-black duplicate with Ravenous Chupacabra to blue-red dupes with Crackling Drake, and just so you know, even mono-blue with Murmuring Mystic is the hot nacho cheese sauce. So today, we're doing our part to add to this pile of data by trying out blue-white, because as it turns out, there are plenty of white creatures with sweet abilities that you might want to turn into Doublemint Gun Twins. So let's see if Azorius aggro can get her done on a budget. Here's blue-white Quasiduplicate. What's up, my wizards? It's D from SB, We Like It a Magic, and you know, in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Clopin says, and yeah, I know this character's name, it's a really good movie, he says that Quasimodo is a cruel name because it means half-formed, and it's a fitting quote because most Quasiduplicate decks that we've seen so far in this format have seemed kind of half-baked. Now, I think that's mostly due to the fact that we have a pretty small card pool right now, like Standard is as small as it gets at the moment, so when we have more creatures in the format, Quasiduplicate's probably going to be a better card. I think that's logic. Question mark. But anyway, we can do some pretty tasty stuff with it right now, even given the small card pool, because there's plenty of creatures with cool into the battlefield triggers or just on-board abilities that you might want to repeat, even in white. Now, we're playing 27 different dudes in this deck, but the one I want to start with is like one of the best reasons to play Quasiduplicate in the deck, and that's Merfolk Trickster. Fist Tricks has been awesome in the mono blue tempo deck, and we're actually porting over at least one other creature from that deck, but this is the coolest creature that we can play from that deck easily, you know? It's got a great into the battlefield trigger, so we want to Quasiduplicate it anyway, but in the meantime, it's just super sweet. We flash it in, we can keep a creature from attacking, or let a creature attack, and then just make it lose all of its abilities and gang tackle it or something. Like, oh, that's always a good option, but we can always just keep a creature from blocking, too, by tapping it down on our turn. That's awesome with Quasiduplicates. Merfolk Trickster is already an undeniably very good card, but it gets even better in a deck where we can copy that ETB trigger over and over. But the other creature that we're porting over from the mono blue deck is Warkite Marauder as a 3-of, because this thing's awesome too. It's one of the few creatures in the deck that doesn't have like an instant value enter the battlefield trigger, but it doesn't need one, because honestly, just going Marauder on turn 2 and then Quasiduplicating it on turn 3 is a fine sequence. Starting on the next turn, you can attack with 2 Marauders and kind of just not care what's on the other side of the board. I mean, there aren't really a whole lot of creatures in Standard that don't have ETB triggers that I would really consider for a Quasiduplicate deck. That's kind of one of the whole points of Quasiduplicate is hitting creatures with ETB triggers, but Andrew WK is too good to leave out of the deck, especially if we're looking for impactful aggro 2-drops. You know, this is just one of the best on the entire Standard menu, so I'm going to play at least 3 copies of this. But there's another 2-drop that doesn't have an Enter the Battlefield trigger that I nonetheless really want to play, and that's Adanto Vanguard, because it's maybe the best 2-drop in the entire format. It defines Standard in some ways, not entirely or anything, but being able to get rid of an Adanto Vanguard is something that most decks really need to be able to do. It's just insanely impactful, tough to deal with, and it attacks for pretty good chunks, so again, I don't mind Adanto Vanguard on turn 2 into Quasiduplicate Adanto Vanguard on turn 3. That's actually a fine play. That's one thing I want to look for, aside from just creatures with ETB triggers, is like, what's good to Quasiduplicate on turn 3? What 2-drops do we not mind effectively paying 3 mana for? And Adanto Vanguard is definitely one of them. If you get a second copy of that out, then you can swing pretty freely with those 2 as well. But without a doubt, at least in this guy's opinion, the best reason to play white in your Quasiduplicate deck is Militia Bugler. This guy is awesome, just all by itself. It's always going to get you a card when it comes down. It's super, super hard to whiff on Horn Dog in this deck because we've got 24 different creatures it can hit, including other Militia Buglers, so keep that in mind. That's a trick you can do. But when you can play Quasiduplicate, it just leads to not quite card advantage, but lots and lots of card selection or cards replacing themselves. You play Militia Bugler, it replaces itself. You play Quasiduplicate on your Bugler, it replaces itself. Discard a card, jumpstart Quasiduplicate, copy Militia Bugler again, it replaces itself. So it's just crazy the amount of cards you can actually get out of this in a given game. And if you're looking for a specific creature, Militia Bugler is often the best way to find it. Also, I'll just end with this because I couldn't find a place to put this joke in like the normal conversational flow of the video, but what song do you think he's playing? I bet it's Taps. Now, there's a lot of options for the 3-drop slot in this deck, but I didn't want things to get too crowded. As it is, we've ended up on 11 3-drops, which is kind of a lot, because we got to count Quasiduplicate as a 3-drop as well, but I still wanted to work in Exclusion Mage here. I think that even though it doesn't want us in its country club, it's still the best card for the 3-drop slot in the deck that we're not already playing. So, I want to play Militia Bugler as a 4-of, but if I had a second option, definitely Mage, you know. This is just a body that sort of produces temporary card advantage. That's really, really good. Like, it doesn't quite count as removal or anything, but it is really nice on turn 3, especially if you're on the play against an aggro deck, to just completely negate a lot of their tempo while putting a body on the battlefield to block, or even attack some of the time. Speaking of crazy enter the battlefield triggers that I want more than once, we're also going to play for Bishop of Binding. We're actually doing this in this deck. This card's only like 20 cents right now, even though it's a rare. I think arena players aren't going to necessarily love this deck because I'm playing a bunch of like junk rares that you don't want to spend wild cards on. There are definitely other things you could do with this slot, but I've started playing Bishop of Binding as a 2-of in the actual Vampires deck to go alongside the 4-of Sanctum Seeker, because I think that it's a better 4-drop in a lot of games than a lot of other Vampire 4-drops you could play besides Sanctum Seeker. You know, once the game goes a little bit longer, Bishop of Binding is a great card once your opponent is out of removal options or they're just out of cards in their hand. Game's running long, we're both in top deck mode. Bishop of Binding can be a great way to get a creature off the battlefield and it actually sticks for multiple turns, you know. And once a Bishop of Binding actually does stick, you know, and it comes around to your next turn and you can untap with it in play, then Quasiduplicate is insanely powerful with this thing just due to one Quasiduplicate. A single copy of Bob can take out 3 different creatures, so put it that way, you definitely want to play Bishop in this deck. But also, here in the 4-drop slot, I'm fitting in a couple of copies of Tempest Caller. I was a little reticent about this card. Is that the right term? I was ambivalent about this card at first, you know, on the fence. Because, yeah, it taps everything down, you get an attack step in, but what about the crackback? You know, always got to worry about that. But after trying out a couple of copies, when you need it, it's really good. Top decking this in the very late game just breaks stalemates and allows you to get through that last like 6 or 8 damage that you might need to finish things off. So I don't think we need to play a handful of this card or anything, but I do really, really like drawing it in the late game, and it's super sweet to Quasiduplicate 2 turns in a row, because it's not quite sleep or anything in that case, but it functions a lot like sleep in that you can get 2 huge attack steps in, and that's sometimes all you need to finish a game off. So Tempest Caller, when it comes to just breaking stalemates and stuff, is too good to not be in the deck. Let me put it that way. Now, I'm playing a sort of questionable card in the 5-drop slot of this deck, but we're looking for good budget options that only cost a few cents, you know, so that we don't just drive this deck through the roof. Because if I'm going to play Quasiduplicate, I don't want to pay that much to do it. I just want to experiment, see what fun we can have, and win a few games doing it. So, with that in mind, a really, really decent rare that's less than a quarter right now is Bishop of Rebirth. I think the best way to succinctly describe what we're trying to get out of this card in this deck is that it's a really budget, duplicatable version of a Johnny Adversary of Tyrants, you know? A card that costs a little bit more than the rest of the stuff on our curve, but we're comfortable playing because it allows us to get value out of our graveyard in the late game, allows us to get some card advantage and keep some gas going, you know? Keep our foot on the pedal. So this card is good for that if it does stick, and if you can Quasiduplicate it, I'll say that again, it gets really, really nasty the amount of value this can actually generate for you. Plus, it's a vampire, so, like, if nothing else, it's got some sideways synergy with Bishop of Binding, so there's that, too. But we are going to play some spells in this deck. We don't have room for too many more, but I do want to get a little bit more serious about our removal package. So, to that end, I'm going to play 3 copies of Baffling End and 2 copies of Ixalan's Binding. Ixalan's Binding is there for when you need the real version of Bishop of Binding. And of course, Baffling End is in there as sort of the short twin version of an Ixalan's Binding, the Danny DeVito to Binding's Arnold Schwarzenegger, if you will. So at least 3 copies of that too. There's plenty of, you know, smaller creatures in this format that cost just a couple of mana that we want to be able to deal with pretty easily, and Baffling is a great out. So we'll definitely play a few copies of that just to make the removal suite a little bit more robust than just Bishop of Binding and Exclusion Mage. Now check out this sweet, sweet mana base right here. This will look a lot better and more expensive once we get Hallowed Fountain in like 5 or 6 weeks now, but it's still a good mana base. Glacial Fortress is fine. We're not doing a whole lot on turn 1, so we can play Meandering River, kind of guilt-free. And then the rest is Islands and Plains. Doesn't take a rocket scientist. Now, as far as the sideboard goes, we do have a lot of options in blue and white, obviously, a few of which would cost us some coin, but I'm mostly going cheap here, you know. I think we do have to play some creatures in the sideboard to go along with our Quasiduplicate plan and not wreck things up too much when we sideboard in. So I am going to play 4 copies of Knight of Grace and 4 copies of Shield Mare and 1 copy of Exclusion Mage to go along. Exclusion Mage will just have a 4th copy against aggro decks. Knight of Grace, obvious 4 copies against black decks. And then Shield Mare, again, obvious. Against aggro decks, it will definitely come in. It's a fantastic 3-drop, especially against any heavy red decks. Aside from that spells, we've got 3 copies of Negate, 1 copy of Disdainful Stroke, and 2 Entrancing Melody. Now, Negate and Disdainful Stroke are kind of self-explanatory. I thought about playing Dive Down or Spell Pierce or something, mostly to protect our Bishop of Binding, but I didn't think it was so important. I felt like Negate and Disdainful Stroke, although a little bit more expensive, are just as good at protecting key creatures a lot of the time, and they can also counter important stuff like Teferi and Binding and all kinds of stuff in this format right now, so they're important cards, but so is Entrancing Melody. This has become a little piece of tech in sideboards lately. It's actually really sweet against a lot of 2-drops in the format, like too many to name, but it's good against creatures all the way up the curve. It's amazing in the late game, and especially in this deck. Sometimes, yeah, we have plenty of creatures to copy ourselves, but sometimes we'd rather quasi-duplicate one of our opponent's creatures, so we can just steal it with Entrancing Melody, and then just copy it. So that's pretty sweet to be able to do too. Now, believe it or not, there's even more options for blue-white Quasiduplicate than I ended up playing in this deck. Like, there's so much to consider for this thing that I didn't end up playing. You know, like I was talking to my buddy John Capra earlier. He does the Pretty Dece series here on YouTube. And I was talking to him about this deck, and he's like, oh, what about Mentor of the Meek? And yeah, that's a fine, especially for the sideboard. It's a fine option. We're a little overloaded on 3-drops as it is. So I'm not quite sure, but I still think that that's a yes. Most of our cards, most of our creatures proc Mentor of the Meek. So yeah, could definitely see playing that for even more card advantage. But there's even Water Trap Weaver while we're on budget 3-drops. I think that'd be great. The ability to freeze a creature. And then quasi-duplicate it and freeze something else. That's also good. So there's a ton of budget options for this deck. There's also Angel of the Dawn if you wanted like a really budget sort of Anthem effect. You quasi-duplicate it, get that Anthem effect again, so that seems pretty sweet. But if you wanted a real Anthem effect, there's Banalish Marshal. You'd really have to rework the mana base to produce a lot of white, but there's that. And I even thought about Tempest Djinn in this deck, mostly because I wanted to make a joke. You know, we're only running 10 islands, so I'm not sure how good Tempest Djinn would actually be, but in Aladdin, the genie says that he's often imitated, but never duplicated. And I just really wanted to quasi-duplicate the genie and prove him wrong, but it's probably a bad call. I'll go a long way for a joke. Now here are your power rankings right here. A final score of 60. It's not actually a bad deck. It's fairly versatile. We've got a decent removal suite. Plus most of our creatures are value town, you know. Most of our creatures have decent enter the battlefield triggers that will allow us to draw into more creatures, return their creatures to their hand, or do all kinds of stuff, you know, or just make their creatures worse in a couple of ways. So a lot of our creatures are fairly strong just in and of themselves, and that makes them good targets for a card like Quasiduplicate. So we're fairly versatile, and depending on what creatures we have on the board at any given time, we get even more versatile. The deck also requires a fairly skilled pilot some of the time. I mean, you'll eke out wins no matter what, but there are going to be a lot of decisions to make in this deck as to what to copy or what to play even in the early stages of the game. You know, do you go Vanguard on turn 2 or do you go Warkite Marauder on turn 2? You know, there's little decisions like that really kind of make the whole game some of the time, because a lot of it is about how you sequence your turns. In any Magic deck, obviously, but especially in this deck, where you're sequencing into Quasiduplicate a lot of the time. So there's going to be a lot of decisions to make, and it's kind of a tempo deck too, and those have a lot of baked-in decisions as well. So skilled, focused pilot. With that in mind, just try this deck out if you feel like it. It's in the description down there if you want to check out the deck list or order any pieces you need from TCG Player. They help sponsor my content, but they're also the cheapest place you're going to get this deck. So if you want to try it out, click the link in the description, check out their wares. But aside from that, pretty sure I'm tapped out for this one. So do the YouTube stuff and make sure you comment on the video. Want to know how you felt about it. It's a weird one, Mr. Grinch, but don't be so grinchy about it. It's a cool deck and I want you to try it out. So let me know how you feel down there, and then like the video if you've got the time to do it. I know we're all busy, but it only takes a second. Hit the thumbs up button. Subscribe to the content if you want more of it. That seems like a rational thing to do. But there's also other stuff. You want to throw $1 around Christmas time to the Patreon? That would be really, really appreciated. Every little dollar really, really matters. And I know you don't all have it. It's hard out there, but if you do have it, consider throwing a buck in the Patreon, and I'll let you vote on what decks you want to see next, and I'll let you know what videos are coming out 24 hours in advance. So a lot of value for a buck. Consider link in the description for that. But aside from that, I guess you can follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev, and I think I'm actually done for this one. So I guess I'll catch you cats later. My job is done here. I want to talk more about this deck. I really like this deck, but I guess my time's up. We'll talk more in the comments section. We'll talk. So get down there, and I'll see you there. In any case, I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.